Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm continuing my discussion with social activist, author, educator Bill Ayers, whose most recent book, and that's what we're going to talk about in this segment, is Demand the Impossible, a Radical Manifesto. Thanks for joining us again, Bill.
Thank you, Paul.
So in your book, you have a picture of the world, and here's a little bit of it. Bill writes, here then is a partial diagram of the known world, a rough sketch of what is, but certainly not a picture of what could or should be. An empire unapologetically resurrected in a cauldron of deliberately constructed fear in the name of renewed patriotic nationalism. Unprecedented military expansion, a state of permanent war and the creation of a war culture. A militarized police force acting as aggressive occupying armies in poor communities. The identification of opaque and ill-defined enemies, illegal immigrants, Muslims, border violators, all as a unifying cause. A panopticon-like existence in which we are all aware of being under constant surveillance. Ritual searches, ID checks, and pat-downs, the eclipse of the public, the frantic pace of privatization, and the fire sale of the public square. Galloping disparities between the haves and the have-nots. A steady drumbeat of public secrets, obvious lies issued by the powerful, like we don't torture, we don't spy on Americans. Disdain for the arts, for intellectual life. Cataclysmic human-made climate change. He ends by saying, the U.S. juggernaut is headed for catastrophe, either a new and sophisticated, dare we say it, form of friendly-looking and familiar fascism, or some other form of extreme social disintegration.
Wow. That's depressing.
Yeah, that ain't either Leave It to Beaver, nor is it any of the current kind of bubble we could live in.
You know, it's interesting that you started there because that is early in the book. But the book, in many ways, the purpose of the book is to note that progressive people and people who are paying attention have a good critique of what is. But what we need, as well as a critique, is we need a sense of what we could be, what could happen. And in many ways, the book is written, the whole notion of be realistic, demand the impossible, which was a graffiti plastered all over the walls of Paris in '68. The idea of it is that this stuff isn't actually impossible. It's well within our reach, but we have to believe it, and we have to have the confidence that we can move toward it. So I often think, you know, you see this bumper sticker that says, if you're not pissed off, you're not paying attention, which I think is good, but you have to add to that. If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. And if you're motivated only by being pissed off and not by love and generosity, you're not going to get there.
Or you can end up with Trump.
Exactly, or you could end up with some of the cataclysms that we've lived through. So my argument is that we need to posit a more utopian vision, partly so that we know where we're going, and partly, and not exactly, not precisely, but that we have a sense of what the parameters of our struggle are, because this is where we want to end. And partly because we need to motivate ourselves to keep going, that there is another world possible, that it's not determined that what we're living in now will always be. And even a brief glance at history shows you that we can do better, and that history has surprised us before, and with any luck, and we could be the agents of this, history will surprise us again.
Yeah, I don't think there's much doubt that if there isn't a vision to fight for, there's only so far fighting against can go. You see it in Baltimore, you know, where we're based. You don't need to persuade anyone, or most people in Baltimore,
what's wrong,
that it's screwed up. In fact, if anything, people have heard enough of that.
Yeah, we need to know what we're fighting for. So, for example, take Baltimore. In terms of police reform, you know, it's worth noting that Freddie Gray was tortured. It's worth noting that Mike Brown was shot by a pistol. It's worth noting that Eric Garner was strangled to death. These were not militarized police forces. So when we focus on getting rid of militarized police forces, maybe we're focused on the wrong goal. Maybe we need to go deeper and ask, what does safety look like in a free society? You know, this notion of utopia, several years ago, 30 years ago, Albie Sachs, the great South African freedom fighter and later constitutional jurist, had a conversation in our living room with the great Palestinian scholar Rashid Khalidi. And the conversation was really about this question of what are we fighting for? And Albie said that they took their fighters aside for retreats, 1 day, 2 days, a weekend, in order to discuss what they were fighting for. And he argued very persuasively that that helped guide the dimensions of the struggle they were involved in. It kept motivation up, but it also kept mistakes to a more of a minimum than they would have been.
Well, let's talk a bit about that issue, because you have a chapter about how to have a safer city and what police reform might look like. It's a very big topic, obviously in Baltimore, but also right across the country. Before we get into what a safer city looks like and some of the police reform suggestions you have, let's talk about another piece of the book which relates to it. You talk about the Black Lives Matter moment. What's the significance of that?
But I think we're living through it. I think it's often hard to see when you're in the middle of living through something what it is. But I think if you periscope back a little bit, you'll notice that we are in the Black Lives Matter moment, and that it's a moment of upsurge, of reinvigoration in the centuries-old Black freedom movement. And the Black freedom movement is what has moved this country forward again and again. It's what's driven us to be the better angels of ourselves when it's asserted itself. And I see what's happening now, and I see it in Chicago so vividly, that these young people who are leading this movement are actually pointing us to a new kind of society, a different kind of world, which isn't just kind of, criminal. It's beyond punitive justice, it's beyond restorative justice, it's transformative justice. So if you read the Black Lives Matter program right now, what you're looking at is, again, I'm looking in Chicago, you're looking at a demand for decent schools in a city that has 40% of its budget goes to the police, and where they closed 54 public schools in Black neighborhoods 2 years ago, and laid off another 1,000 teachers 2 months ago, and hired 1,000 cops 2 weeks ago. I mean, this is a recipe for social suicide. And the Black Lives Matter movement has nailed that. We want schools. We want meaningful work to do, not just jobs as blackjack dealers or, hamburger flippers. We want real work to do to restore our dying cities. We want mental health clinics reopened, which you've closed under the myth of austerity. These are things that it reminds me of nothing so much as the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party, reinvigorated for today's world, much more sophisticated.
Yeah, there's the memory, the cultural memory of the Panthers is just, guys standing out in front of a place with shotguns.
Right.
But they, in fact, were socialist with a whole socialist proposal.
Well, and I dare say that the young people in Chicago, and I know some of them nationally, but I know the folks in Chicago pretty well, they're not only mindful of that, they've read Assata Shakur's biography, they've read the works of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and they've read Martin Luther King, and they've read Frantz Fanon, and they're not naive. They are very sophisticated in what they're looking for and what they're organizing around. And the other good news is they're organizers. So when I was at a meeting a year or so ago, and somebody was saying, why aren't there more young people at this boring old person's meeting? And somebody, it was actually a former SNCC member, said to the guy who'd asked the question, do you go to the young people's meetings? And of course the old guy said, do they have meetings? Yes, they have meetings, and you don't know about it because you're stuck in some other paradigm. Open your eyes, pay attention, be astonished at what's going on, dive in, do something, and then doubt. And this is maybe the part of that rhythm that the Weather Underground got wrong for a period of time. You have to open your eyes to be an activist, to be a moral citizen. Open your eyes, pay attention, be astonished by both the beauty and the ecstasy as well as the pain and the suffering. Then do something, and then doubt. Repeat for a lifetime. That to me is the rhythm of activism. That's what I see being enacted on the streets of Chicago. I couldn't be more excited.
Speaking of Chicago and speaking of Black lives, something we should talk about, and I think there is a connection here too. Many of the young people that are involved in Black Lives Matter, not all, but many, were rather excited with the election of President Obama and first Black president, and to some extent the disillusionment with the lack of any accomplishments by Obama on behalf of Black communities, and some people could say in terms of how the financial crisis was handled, worse than lack of accomplishments. Even more wealth was shifted to the 1% during the Obama administration. And this the number that gets thrown around a lot, but I think we should ever stop throwing it around. which is 90% of the post-08 crisis increase in incomes, 90% of that increase went to 1% of the population.
That's right. Yeah.
But you knew Obama, and we can't not finish this interview without talking a little bit about that whole incident, because we are going to pick this up again and continue discussing the book and some of the other issues. But in terms of Obama, we know he was asked about you during the election, and we'll just quickly run that clip again.
On this issue, general theme of patriotism in your relationships, a gentleman named William Ayers. He was part of the Weather Underground in the 1970s. They bombed the Pentagon, the Capitol, and other buildings. He's never apologized for that. And in fact, on 9/11, he was quoted in the New York Times saying, "I don't regret setting bombs. I feel we didn't do enough." An early organizing meeting for your state Senate campaign was held at his house, and your campaign has said you're friendly. Can you explain that relationship for the voters and explain to Democrats why it won't be a problem?
George, but this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is a guy who lives in my neighborhood, who's a professor of English in Chicago, who I know and who I have not received some official endorsement from. He's not somebody who I exchange ideas from on a regular basis. The notion that somehow, as a consequence of me knowing somebody who engaged in detestable acts 40 years ago when I was 8 years old, somehow reflects on me and my values doesn't make much sense, George.
Tell us a little bit about what was your experience with him during, and we'll get to kind of what you think of what his years in office were.
You know, I may be the only radical revolutionary in America who was not disillusioned with Obama's presidency. And the reason I wasn't is because I knew him and I believed him when he said, "I'm a moderate, middle-of-the-road, pragmatic Democrat." That's what he said. And the right wing looked at him and said, no, 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 he's a raving black nationalist who pals around with terrorists and has socialist inclinations. That was all false.
You had to just read his speeches and you knew that.
Read his speeches, look at his legislative record in Illinois. The left looked at him and said, he's winking at me. I don't believe that he's a moderate. But the fact is he was a moderate, middle-of-the-road Democrat. And there are two things to note about him. One is it was actually an accomplishment for this country to elect a black man to be president of the United States. It was a blow against white supremacy. It wasn't a decisive blow. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was important. And I don't think that people should mock that at all. But if anyone expected him to bring a revolutionary program or a mildly socialist program into office, they were dreaming. They were delusional.
Or even a New Deal-ish
Or
program.
even a New Deal. They were delusional in the way that Noam Chomsky talks about.
No doubt.
So that's all true. The other thing, though, about President Obama is that African Americans, I think correctly, have a knee-jerk response to defending him. And the reason they do is because white supremacy is all around them. It's the name of the game. And when Obama gets pushed on by this disgusting, racist, backward society, and you see people like Mitch McConnell, a political leader in this country, saying, my whole goal is to make sure this guy doesn't get reelected, I think African Americans correctly say, you know, I'm not going to let him be out there all by himself. I'm going to stand with him for that. I don't think people are you know, that delusional about what else he's going to do. So that, I would say, that Obama has done pretty much what you would expect. If you look at the longer history of the United States, I mentioned before, we don't pay enough attention to the sites of power we have access to, because what's really changed the world is when masses of people stand up and demand it. Justice is not automatic. So Lyndon Johnson passed the most far-reaching civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. He was not part of the Black Freedom Movement. He was responding to fire from below. FDR, responding to fire from below. And you take Abraham Lincoln, who not only didn't belong to an abolitionist party, but you read his first inaugural address, it's a law and order speech. Then you read John Brown on the gallows. Then you read Lincoln's second inaugural address and you say, man, John Brown could have written that. I mean, things change, but they change because of fire from below, not because of the good. I often think, you know, when I hear people say, or textbooks say, the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, unleashed decades of activism, they get it just backwards. Decades of activism led to the Brown. So it is with Obama. So it is with Obama. The people who made some progress during the last 7 years were the people who didn't shut up, who didn't get into the closet. So, you know, you think about him running for president in 2008 and saying, as a Christian, I of course stand against same-sex marriage, 2008. And 4 years later, big mouth Joe Biden comes out in favor of it, followed by Ernie Duncan, followed by a movement that never went away, and Obama's for same-sex marriage. What an amazing shift right in front of our eyes.
How much interaction did you and other lefties have with him? He heard all the arguments? He debated or not? I mean, did he live in a kind of a bubble himself?
I don't think
or was he hearing
a bubble.
all
I
this?
think he was a community organizer, and frankly, I think that he was a community organizer of the Alinsky type, which is a kind of moderate liberal community organizer, and in many ways he was and is not only a compassionate human being, but the smartest guy in almost any room you go into. But that doesn't make him a leftist, right? I mean, he's very, very smart, very well informed, and because he was a community organizer, he actually has in his grasp experiences that a president of this country ought to have. Now, did it allow him to do things, to move the country in ways that he might have? Not really. But I still think that it's worth noting that when he says things like, kind of channeling Franklin Roosevelt, and he says, if you want universal health care, make me do it. You know, that's a community organizer speaking.
Yeah, except that was very convenient, but there's choices he made that made sure, for example, that you hand the Senate committee over to Baucus and then you don't have one person there that supports universal health care.
Without a doubt. He made choices.
You choose Goldman Sachs as your finance team. I mean, there wasn't even like liberally New Deal-ishy, social democratic-y stuff going on there. It was straight Clinton corporatism.
But you're absolutely right, and that's part of why, incidentally, the people who feel the kind of soft spot for Obama and are absolutely rigid about
Can I
Hillary
mitigate
Clinton.
one thing?
Sure.
As critical as one could be about Obama,
Yeah.
you know, wait for what's coming. Yeah.
Well, I suppose, but I do think that our attention is drawn in the wrong direction. In other words, I think we spend too much time thinking about elections, even third parties.
But I'm trying to get the inner workings of his head, because someone who's as smart as he is, and obviously he is, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm left that his driving force is just his own careerism, because if you don't so embrace imperialism, so embrace it.
Yeah,
even if he's a little more mitigating than maybe some of the other choices would be on Syria and some other things.
I think you're right. But I think that once he ran for president and once he sat in the throne of empire and commanded its violent legions, that's exactly what you would expect. I don't see what else we could expect.
I never expected more. I'm just trying to get
but
sense
what we
of him.
can expect, and I think this is worth noting. So I mentioned that we're living in the Black Lives Matter era. We're also living in the post-Bernie Sanders campaign. We're also living in the Occupy moment. We're also living in the undocumented and unafraid moment. You know, the young people. We're living in the queer, I'm here, I'm queer moment. These things are coming together in ways that are miraculous and phenomenal.
We don't have too much time, so I just want to ask you, it's kind of a final question, except I'm sure it won't be quick. So the Sanders moment opened up a kind of a shred in mainstream politics. I don't think anyone that constructed the modern Democratic Party, or Republican, but in this case Democratic Party, ever imagined that any candidate that was progressive and would really challenge and use words like the oligarchy and the billionaire class and all that could ever raise so much bloody money.
Amazing.
And now that, because of that, I mean, you had a real horse race here, and whether it was rigged in the final analysis or not, whatever. I think that isn't the primary reason Sanders lost. I mean, just things, there were weaknesses in the campaign, and why wouldn't there be? I'm sure Sanders was more surprised than anyone that it ever became competitive.
Absolutely.
But if one, and I do, think of the Republican and Democratic parties as actually part of the state. It's not like there's a government and parties run over here and then somebody gets elected to the government.
Right.
They're actually part of the state apparatus. That Sanders campaign was a fracture, a tear in a big, important piece of the state. On the other hand, that movement that was all behind Sanders, kind of the air, to a large extent, has gone out. A lot of people are wondering what's next. There's talk about focus on down ballot races and so on. What do you make of that moment, and what do you think comes next, and what should people be doing next?
Were you disappointed that Sanders didn't run as an independent?
No. Personally, you're asking me? No, I think it was clear he never would. You have to think he would, and to be disappointed. I actually don't think, in fact, he should have. Exactly. I do think, if giving a personal opinion here, I don't think he had to give such full-throated endorsement.
Right. I agree.
I think he could have been just anti-Trump and say, look, Hillary and I have disagreements, but we got to stop Trump. But the fact that he talks so positively about her creates illusions, and I don't agree with that.
You know, people on the left who say that Occupy was a failure miss a lot of things. They miss the fact that the 1% to 99% was invented at Occupy. They miss the fact that Occupy linked up with Black Lives Matter around the execution of Troy Davis, and that became a whole energy about where is Obama? Where are we in this country? The fact that the climate change activists are blockading Standing Rock and other places. These things are all part of what made the Sanders moment possible. So I don't think you would have had the Sanders moment without Occupy, without mass movement on the ground. And so it was what it was, but I think it created, as you say, a break in the kind of establishment narrative. And I think more importantly, it introduced to masses of young people the idea that socialism was worth exploring. This happened also in 2008, incidentally. There were polls taken because Obama was called a socialist by everyone on the right for months. So I could picture some kid in Iowa Googling socialism, and from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Hell, it sounds biblical, and I think that socialism got a big boost then too.
Even Obama said that when in the last week of the campaign, when McCain was trashing him for being a socialist,
right.
And he says, "Well, my Bible teaches I should be my brother's keeper."
That's
the
right.
only really line I liked in the whole election campaign.
But the fact is that it's deeper than that. There's a real crisis in this country, and this is what animated the Sanders campaign. It was a mass movement, but the mass movement is based on a real crisis, on real oppression. And I think that the political class and the 1% have no answers for the crisis that we're in. In fact, if I were to name the political moment simply, I would say what's politically possible in mainstream real politics is up against what's urgently necessary if we're going to survive. And I think that contradiction is going to be acted out in 1,000 ways. Standing Rock, the Native American seizure of the land and the water is one iteration of that, but it's going to escalate. And there's nothing that Obama or Hillary Clinton or the political class can do about it. And so we are in a position where we can dive into that contradiction in a way that's hopeful and confident, not optimistic, because we don't know what's going to happen, but we should dive into it with full force to make sure that we're heard and that we're understood in the public square. Again, I don't know how to predict, and I'm not a predictor of what's coming, but it's very clear that the crisis in the Democratic Party is deep and abiding, and it's very clear that the crisis in the Republican Party is deeper and more abiding. The danger that we face, there's many dangers that we face, a warmongering country run amok with very little standing in the world except for military power, and with a decreasing power in every other dimension, but military power ascendant. That's a treacherous, dangerous situation. But the other thing—
throw climate change in.
And climate change is, that's when I say, you look at Paris. Paris is a perfect contradiction. It's the best we could hope for, and it's completely inadequate.
Yes, 6 of the leading climate scientists in the world came out a few weeks ago and said that if every country that fulfills every pledge made at Paris, we're still hitting 2 degrees warming by 2050.
Exactly. So what we've got is they went to Paris. We got a better agreement than has ever been imagined, and yet they agreed to do half of what was necessary to actually solve the problem. So cataclysmic climate change, imperialism in crisis and decline, militarism on the go. And here's the other danger. The other danger in my mind is that the Trump campaign became a vehicle where all the white supremacist and nativist forces, which always exist, there's a material basis for them, saw each other, found each other, articulated a common program. That fascist base is there. And so that's not going away. So that crisis, the crisis in the Democratic Party, the growth of an understanding that capitalism can't solve the basic problems that we're facing as a nation or as a world, these things are coming to a head, and that means we ought to all be absolutely ready. Get your running shoes on, and pick up your fist and get ready.
Get organized.
Get organized.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of time.
Not a lot of time. I think the crisis, the contradictions are very, very real.
Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll pick this up again.
Paul, thanks very much. Pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.